I think that's the way the movie wants us to look at this gift that Louise is given, is that, we all know our life in that same sense that, you and I, we're both going to be dead someday. And I think along the way, maybe we'll lose like loved ones, or we'll lose friends, or we'll do really nice things. We have really nice experiences. There's going to be joy and pleasure and fun and less fun things. That's going to be, we all have, the path of life is already laid out in like these broad strokes. And so I think the more sort of message here is to just embrace that in its fullness and not try to shrink down from life in order to try and escape a death that will come for us anyways.
Hello and welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast from myself, Thomas Flight, and from my fellow video essayist, Tom Vanderlinden, from the channel Like Stories of Old, that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. In this episode, we're going to be discussing Denis Villeneuve's Arrival. But before we get into that, I want to mention real quick, Nebula. This is a Nebula original podcast. You can listen to this podcast on Nebula, and when you do, you'll get access to episodes a whole week early and without any ads. You'll also get access to our bonus episodes. We've talked about shows like Netflix's Beef. We've talked about movies like Drive, and 2001: A Space Odyssey, I think, was another bonus episode that we did, another big sci-fi film that you can build on this discussion with. Information is in the description below for how to sign up for Nebula and enjoy the podcast that way. But for now, let's just get right into the discussion. Tom, this movie, I think, is one that you have seen a lot. This was one of those where you were like, I could probably talk about this without rewatching it. I think I maybe hadn't seen it since theaters. That might not be true. If I did, I rewatched it shortly afterwards, after it came out but it's been years since I've seen it. But it's a great movie. I didn't not rewatch it for a specific reason. It just was one of those that I hadn't seen a bunch of times. But I think I love Denis' work. Obviously, I think he does really unique science fiction work, especially. Blade Runner 2049 and Dune are some of my favorite sci-fi films, at least from the modern era. But I think even within his sci-fi work, this one is positioned in kind of a very unique space. So yeah, I'm excited to kind of dive into it and discuss what's going on in this unique little film. But maybe
you
can give me
the story it was based on?
No, I haven't read the book.
Oh, okay.
So I had no familiarity with it going in the first time, and I haven't read it since. Did you?
Yes.
Okay.
I think
prior to seeing it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I checked it out, I think, after the movie was announced, or maybe even after the trailer came out, where I was like, oh, this looks really fascinating, but it's going to be like a few months, and it's only a short story, which it is based on by Ted Chiang. And so I figured, oh, maybe I'll check it out beforehand, and then I'll get the full experience with the movie. And in hindsight, I kind of regret it. Or I kind of regret reading the short story first, because the movie, I think it's very faithful, and it very much captures the essence of the story, but the movie has more of a twist. I'm just going to spoil it right away. I'm going to assume you've seen the movie. Because there's this whole thing where the movie sets up what feels like backstory to Louise, like her memories, and then at the end it's revealed, oh, this was actually her future vision, or perception of her own future.
Or at least something that in chronological order takes place like after the central like encounter of the story.
And in the novel, or in the short story, this kind of becomes, I don't remember actually if it becomes like explicitly clear at the beginning or from the beginning, but the way it is written already reveals like some sort of there's something off about the temporality of the story, because it will have like these grammatically incorrect, or at least in a chronological timeline, the grammar would be incorrect. It would say things like, Louise remembers how her daughter will do this on her birthday, or something like that. There's kind of like this intertwinement of like the past and future tense in a way that doesn't quite make sense until you come to understand, like, oh wait, she's actually remembering the future. And so yeah, in that sense, the short story kind of spoiled for me what I think would have been a more interesting twist. Or I wished in hindsight I would have been able to experience that twist like everyone else did, and then just read the short story afterwards. But yeah, all that aside, I still very much enjoyed the movie. And I think that this might be the only movie that I can speak to with some authority, because I once made a video essay about Arrival, and then like a few years later I got an email from Denis Villeneuve's wife, who was writing a book on the production of Arrival, and there was a little section at the end there which talked about the meaning and the emotion in the movie. That book apparently got published already. I think it's called The Art and Science of Arrival or something like that. I actually haven't read it myself, but I got like the segment where I'm mentioned, and it says like, I figured it was going to be like a quick sort of accolade thing, like, everyone loves this movie. This is what this YouTuber had to say about it. And it would be like this short one sentence thing of where I said like how much I loved Arrival, but it's really like this extended passage that really talks about how I got the movie right, essentially. So I was like, yes.
Certified correct interpretation.
Yes, exactly. That was really cool and really like affirmative.
That's awesome.
Have an interpretation of mine kind of given some authors or being like confirmed by like the author's intent to some extent. Didn't get to talk to Denis directly, unfortunately, but I think his wife is as close as a connection as
we're going to get for now. Yeah. Denis, if you're out there, we'd love to chat.
So yeah, I think this would be a great opportunity to kind of walk through that essay again, and also just to revisit the movie now. It's one of my oldest videos, I think, and I kind of hate to listen back to it now because I just hate the way I sounded back then, but I didn't have a bigger point with that. I guess I just wanted to brag a little bit. But
all that to say, yes, it's some cool context for this discussion, and also, this is one of those movies that goes back, like you're saying, to kind of the early days of your channel and your foray into sort of film analysis and those kinds of things. So it's fun to revisit that. Do you feel like there's anything, I guess, unless people have watched it, maybe you want to like lay a groundwork for kind of what you cover in that video. But my, I guess, follow-up question to that already would be, is there any way in which your perception or interpretation of this movie has shifted or expanded over time since maybe you first made that video or first watched the film?
I think it's still largely the same. I once made I made another video on Villeneuve's work in general. So I guess it did get more grounded within his larger filmography instead of just being this sort of standalone interpretation. Especially after Dune, I think he very much established some deeper themes about the nature of fear, and especially also the relation to fear and life, in a sense. In the sense that we are both afraid of death and afraid of life, and so we kind of navigate a strange space in between as we go through life, basically. And that to me was also very much present in Dune. There's that whole famous litany that's the novelist known for with Fear is the Mind Killer
Yeah.
and so on. But yeah, I still think, especially after now, having also seen Blade Runner and Dune, that I still like Arrival for being a more emotional story in some sense. It's very much grounded in Louise's story and her own experience of the sort of more science fiction-y stuff, which to me makes it a more humanistic, or at least it feels like a more humanistic story, a more directly humanistic story. I think Blade Runner is also very much about humanism, but it's also a little bit, because that's the world of Blade Runner, it's a little bit bleaker, a little bit more emotionally disconnected.
Right.
In a way that I think Arrival is, it's just a bit warmer, I would say.
I mean, it's the rare kind of like, I don't want to say like it's kind of like the rare positive optimistic science fiction film, to be honest. Like most of the sci-fi we get is, at least in this kind of movie, is kind of bleak or dystopian or something like that. So even from Denis' other work, I think. So that's kind of a nice change of pace.
Yeah. So let's just cover it from the beginning, see what the story is about, what it has to say, what it
or
all
should we
means.
maybe start at the end and move in a circular manner? Just kidding. That's what we normally do actually on this podcast. So maybe we should go linear through the non-linear story in this case.
Yeah, that's the tricky thing. You can't really. The interesting thing I will say about this movie, something that I think a lot of people still don't tend to talk about as much, is that the way there's this kind of play on the Kuleshov effect at the beginning of the story, where you, as we said, like the movie opens with these memories, or at least what appears to us as memories. We have Louise playing with her daughter, and it then evolves into this kind of tragic story where her daughter gets ill and she passes away. And it then cuts to like the present time, or at least what we then think is the present time, where she's just going about her day. She's a teacher at a school. And so we interpret her character as someone who is in grief, who has experienced this great trauma and who is now kind of, that's like her character baggage as the story moves forward. But then at the end, of course, it's revealed like, oh no, all that stuff that you saw in the beginning, that's coming to her in the future. That's not, she has no awareness of all this for the majority of the story. But I think what a lot of people at the time, at least, weren't really asking is, okay, now that we no longer have this backstory, like, what is Louise's character then at the beginning of the story like?
Right.
Without this grief or without this trauma that we thought defined her, or that we thought defined her character, who is she really after realizing that that trauma is all in the future? And that I think wasn't, to me at least at the time when I wrote my essay, that was kind of my initial starting point. Like, who is this character really at the start of the story, and from where does she evolve after the aliens arrive? And I think my take on that was kind of that she was obviously not in grief, but or at least not that we know of. And there is obviously not a lot of clues as to what her actual backstory may have been, because the backstory that we had was taken away from us. So it's kind of leaves this empty space there.
We get like maybe that one line that she says to Jeremy Renner's character about like, trust me, you can understand communication and still be single. And then we know she did some, she has top secret clearance and she did some interpretation for the government in the past, but that's kind of all we get, besides the other information we just see about her life. She lives in a nice house. She's a professor somewhere. She's obviously respected in her film.
She lives in
or
a
in her
nice house, but
field.
she also lives alone. And she has like this
Yes.
giant, almost comically giant body pillow that she sleeps with at night, which
Yeah.
I think that's like not something you put in a movie randomly. That's a kind of signifier that she is maybe lacking in connection or lacking in a certain intimacy that she then has to replace with this
Right.
giant pillow. But yeah, my take was kind of that she's just someone who is very much reclusive in a sense, or at least emotionally reclusive. She kind of lives sheltered in the sense that she doesn't let um, anything really come close to her, and in that way she also prevents herself from being hurt or being impacted negatively by the world around her. I think it was also very interesting how she very much seems like a creature of habit, like someone who's very much stuck in patterns and who's just um, very rigid about her life. You can kind of see a hint of that when, after the aliens come to the planet, there's obviously a lot of upheaval in the society about that. But then the next day, Louise is kind of like, she calls her mom and she says like, "Oh, I'm about the same," and then she goes to school
Right.
as if it's like any other day,
Yeah.
only to find her classroom completely empty. And so that, to me, suggests that, okay, there's something that's been greatly affecting everyone else, but she is not letting it in, like she's not letting it happen.
Yeah.
And kind of the deeper theory that I used at the time was the writing of Ernest Becker, who talked about how we as humans are afraid of death, or we have an awareness of our own death, and so we fear that we eventually have to die. But we also realize that life itself, because life itself is so intrinsically linked to death, um, to deny death would also mean to shrink away from life. And so instead, we try to, the book is called Denial of Death. So that's the whole deal, that we, or so he argues, that we tend to deny our mortality by shrinking down from the fullness of life. And I think Louise kind of embodies that rather extreme version
Yeah.
of that, where she's just living this very monotone life. And that's also her journey then, to kind of open herself up to death and life and mortality and
Right.
tragedy in order to just also experience life. She has to accept death to also get the life, and
Yeah.
to just experience life in its full, broad, emotional range. And it's just, I think that's kind of jumping ahead a little bit, what her journey along the way signifies.
Yeah.
And there's some steps along the way, but I think that's the main sort of arc that goes on here.
That's kind of the structural twist too, is the movie ends with death and it begins with death, excuse me, and ends with life beginning. And the you kind of, when you see the death at the beginning, this reversal, when you experience that scene at the beginning, I think you kind of expect to come back to that point, to like revisit that at the end. But instead, by the end, you get to the beginning of the thing leading up to that. And the significance there is less like this thing that is going to happen. It is just a fact that we kind of experience throughout the story, and see the beginning, middle, and end spread throughout the story. But then the arc, instead of the event itself, the arc ends up being her acceptance and embrace of that event, that life and death, in spite of her knowledge of that. So yeah, I think that's a very interesting arc to go on, and it's great to connect that to like the denial of death and those kinds of things, because this is to some extent a journey that we are faced with. Like, we don't have the knowledge of what is going to happen or these specific events, but we do have sort of this knowledge of something happening, being in the midst of this thing that we don't have control over, but we do have a choice of kind of either accepting or attempting to avoid and deny. And so, yeah, that's the end of this film. That's the emotional arc concludes. Now maybe we should talk about the aliens.
Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna say the aliens, I think, form that interesting metaphor in that sense for existence itself as something that kind of forces Louise to content with her own life and the implications of not fully embracing it. And I think in general, just I really love the way the aliens are kind of non-threatening. At least they're not like apocalyptic aliens. They don't seem to go or come to our planet to do violence or to start a war or to do anything really. Like, I like that their motivation remains somewhat unclear, and I think in the novel too, it's never explained why exactly the aliens, or the heptapods they're called, come to Earth. The movie makes it a little bit more explicit that they are coming to give the gift of time, and they have that little bit of an explanation where 3,000 years or so from now, heptapods will need help, and then humans will help them. So now they must, because they kind of live non-chronologically, they now come to Earth to help us so that we can later help them. None of that is in the short story, but I don't think it necessarily harms the thematic weight that they represent. Because I love the way there's that line when Louise is kind of explaining to the officer like how the language stuff works, or the that's of getting to them to understand the question and getting them to understand grammar and so on, and just the difficulties of communication. That's when she also lays out the main question that everyone is after, and then that she writes on the board. I think it was something like, "What is your purpose on Earth?" Which is also very much an interesting question that we
for humans
can ask ourselves.
Right.
Which I think that's how this movie so nicely uses these aliens as that metaphor to kind of dive into these existential questions that also pertain to us and that we are also struggling to answer. And that's, I think, also where the theme of language comes in and plays a very important role, where you have a big deal about this movie is, or the big premise of this movie is that Louise is this renowned translator, and she is therefore sent into the alien chamber. She has to go up there with like another scientist and a few others, and anyways, the goal is that she has to translate or find a way to communicate with them to figure out what they want. And it's in that process of learning their language that she also finds out more about her own existence and about existence in general. So yeah, I just love the way language plays such an important role in this, because going back to like the Ernest Becker stuff about shrinking away from life and shrinking away from the overwhelmingness of just our conception of the universe and what that represents, language is also such an important tool to kind of categorize and thereby repress our experience of life, because, language is inherently a simplification of what we experience. Like, if you have two chairs, for example, and they look exactly the same, made of exactly the same material, philosophically speaking, they're still 100% like different chairs, because there's not a single atom in the one chair that's also in the other. They're like purely physically speaking, they're just 100% distinct, and yet because we use language to kind of categorize stuff, that's how we make things easy to comprehend and just easy to navigate. And that's not a bad thing. That's how we make life work for us in the without just being completely overwhelmed by the sheer chaos that otherwise would flood into our brain. Um, but at the same time, in that sense, language can also be too restrictive and too constraining, and that's, I think, so I like the way the heptapods kind of use language as their tool to make their way into her mind, and kind of have that be the trigger instead of like anything environmental or anything related to violence, to move the plot forward and to also thematically explore these more existential questions.
Yeah.
And besides that, it's just very interesting. I think we talk about this with every science fiction movie we discuss, I think, but I always love movies that just really get into the nitty gritty of something when they're exploring like a subject like language. Like I want to hear like all the theories on language. I want to hear those deconstructions. I want to have Louise standing in front of that whiteboard and explain everything in detail. Like that's the stuff which, to me, I think then makes movies like these interesting. And so that's also one of the things that I really loved about Arrival, is that it doesn't skip over what is, or what could so easily be seen by maybe a studio executive as just the boring exposition.
Right.
And I just love the way Denis understood, no, this is actually like the essence of this whole story, and it needs to be addressed with the proper attention and the proper consideration. And I think that's what really elevates this movie from being just another alien contact story.
It really gets something which I think it really focuses on something which I think is kind of correct about life, which is the presuppositions that you bring to something are incredibly important in how you end up interpreting those things. And that ends up kind of being like a central conflict, is Luis is coming from this sort of attempting to approach this translation with this sort of presupposition of peacefulness or cooperation, or at least neutrality. And that is primarily informing her approach to it, how she's interpreting things, how she's thinking about whether or not, they know exactly what weapon means, and these kinds of things. And even in just how she approaches the whole process kind of organically, with a focus on actually creating some kind of connection. So she's getting to the bottom of like, in order for us to figure out the utility of what we're doing here, we need to first do what language is even trying to do in the first place, which is to facilitate some kind of like connected communication. And she really understands that kind of starts beneath language. Like there's something underneath language. And we see that with how like she wants to be outside the suit and put her hand on the thing, and like, and I think that's very real and very human, because that's how we absorb and understand language, is sort of through this like organic, you can learn a language in your adulthood by, doing Duolingo or something, or like, talking to people. But like our original introduction to language is not in a school. It is with other people, like talking to us as children, and physically interacting with us and communicating with us. So there's that, and then also the thing I said before, which is like this presupposition of informing her interpretation, and we see that in contrast to the CIA and military guys who kind of have this presupposition of aggression, and that kind of leading the way in terms of how they interpret these kind of the ambiguities in communication. And I think that's something that's like so practical to our everyday lives, and how we think about the meaning of things, even when we're not trying to communicate with a new species.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, especially because I always saw the uh, Louise taking off the suit as also just kind of a symbol of her literally like coming out of her shell and increasingly making herself more vulnerable to life, which again would then be represented by the
Right.
heptapods. But I also like your interpretation of why she would take that first step. And um, I was also thinking there's something ironic about her, because as you said, the military guys, they are very much reacting more fearful and more aggressive towards the aliens, or again, to life itself, which to them is something scary and maybe capable of destroying them, doing death, like but in that sense, because Louise is so much she has so much shielded herself off from life and from death, she also maybe lacks that fear that those other military guys might experience, or might have them reacting more panicky than Louise does. So in that sense, there's a kind of maybe even like a childlike naivete about the way she is so comparatively more willing to expose herself to these aliens, or to get the suit out and to take that first step. But yeah, it's I think it's just interesting in the way, or the way that these aliens, just the psychological effect that they have on everyone around them. There's this whole subplot that I think wasn't in the story or it wasn't in the short story, where there's a group of like rogue soldiers that at some point they get like caught up in these almost like these conspiracy channels and these um, I don't know, these kind of very panic-inducing commentators that then have them in a panic, and they feel the need to act violently towards
Yeah.
the heptapods, and they attempt to blow them up, which kills one of them, but which leaves the other one, and that's the one who ultimately reveals to Louise the true meaning of the language that they've been teaching her. That's just an interesting dynamic in the way you consider like everyone's uh, distinctive response to the heptapods, and how you would equate that if you take them as a metaphor to life, like how certain people see the uncertainty of that and see maybe project their own fears onto that, and then use that to act cruelty or with violence, or um, with just a state of panic instead of a more reasoned negotiation or conversation, maybe would be a better word, in the way that Louise does it. Because what ends up happening with her is that she ends up having this very nice, or very nice, I'm not sure if that's the best way to describe it, but this very, I don't know, kind of just this warm conversation with existence in this sense, which might even like be inspired by something like The Seventh Seal, or movies like that, which also have these characters that directly communicate with some kind of representative of all the uncertainty about life and all the existential questions that we might have. And
how do you think this translates kind of into philosophically how we think about our own lives? Because a lot of the same questions are there, but ultimately we're not striving to learn a nonlinear language so that we can see the future. This is sort of more of like a symbolic move that is kind of representing how we engage with how we think about our lives. But how do you think about that? And then I also have something that might be related that I kind of want to mention or maybe read here.
Yeah, I think because the thing is, at first glance, if you take it at like face value, the gift that Louise receives, she learns the language of the heptapods. She starts having these visions, which we think are memories, but which we later learn are like future memories.
Yeah.
And then it's revealed to us that the gift that she's been given is the gift of foresight. She basically she can see into the future. She sees what her life's going to look like. And that's because of the heptapod language, which, that's the part, that's the science fiction part that doesn't quite really make sense, but, and I think some people have taken like the wrong interpretations there, where they feel like the question that this movie raises is more about, if you could know the future, would you still want it, or something like that. But to me, that sort of what if isn't as interesting, and I feel like that's also where if you go down that road, you quickly end up in that loop where it's like if you can see the future, but you still have the agency to choose a different future, then you did not really see the future. But you see, that's kind of a loop that I'm not really interested in.
Same.
And I don't think that's the kind of question that the movie is about. I think in the end, the idea that Louise can see the future is very much a metaphor for the way in which we can all see our future, basically. And the way, because Louise was so cut off from like life and death that she didn't envision really any. She didn't really have like any of that meta awareness about her own life, to kind of state it somewhat dramatically. And it's because she embraced, or like she came to understand, the aliens, the heptapod language, the language of life. She now also comes to understand, like, oh wait, I'm really going to die someday, and along the way I'm gonna have like all these tragedies, and there's gonna be hardship and pain and grief, but there's also gonna be like love and happiness and joy, and there's no, the whole experience of having a daughter, even though she passes way too early and leaves her with like this big grief. And so I think that's the way the movie wants us to look at this gift that Louise is given, is that, we all know our life in that same sense, that, you and I, we're both going to be dead someday. And I think along the way, maybe we'll lose like loved ones, or we'll lose friends, or we'll do really nice things. We have really nice experiences. There's going to be joy and pleasure and fun and less fun things. That's going to we all have, the path of life is already laid out in like these broad strokes. And so I think the more sort of message here is to just embrace that in its fullness, and not try to shrink down from life in order to try and escape a death that will come for us anyways. I think that's what the movie is arguing at the end, and what I think makes it such a humanistic story that relates to everyone's life, and the way we can position ourselves against it.
I love that. I want to read this thing from a writer named Sophie Strand. She has a newsletter called Make Me Good Soil. But I found this randomly this morning. Another newsletter that I'm subscribed to linked to this one, and had a little excerpt. And I just clicked on it and read it, and wasn't really thinking much about it. And then I watched this movie, and they both kind of resonated with each other. So I kind of wanted to share just a small excerpt from that in this podcast. But the post is called A Cartography of Encounters. And I'm going to just read a small quote from a few different sections. She says, "Take a piece of paper, a pen, and draw your life. In most instances, we draw a line slicing the paper into a linear horizon, a thrust of causality, segmented by birthdays, achievements, graduations, marriages, illnesses. Our desire for real initiations still often depends on a clear demarcation of before and after, a syntactical structure where one word leads naturally to the next, punctuation cleaves breath pinned to paper, leaving accumulated meaning in its wake. My life is not straight and does not make sense read left to right. Let me ask you again to draw your life, but now with a slight shift in perspective. Do not draw a line. Draw a map of the encounters you have had with animals, insects, birds, weather systems, microbes that have metaphorically rearranged your matter. Draw a constellation of these encounters. What shape does your life take on when it is no longer articulated by the grammar of human progress? But I think she does a beautiful job of, has nothing to do with Arrival. I'm sure she's probably seen the movie, but I think she does a beautiful job of articulating how that language our human language has instilled this like sense of linearity to how we think about our lives. And I think part of what you're talking about, part of that embrace of life, to some extent has to do with like embracing life outside of that sort of linear like sense of time, because that's how we often conceive of our lives when we sort of like present it as a narrative to other people, but that's not really how we experience it in memory or in the present moment. And the reality of how our life unfolds in experience is much more complicated and messy, at least in how it feels to us personally from our own perspective. And so I think there's kind of this like, even though you can't learn an alien language that lets you see the future, you can open yourself up emotionally to a sort of experience of life that is much more like non-linear in a sense, in how you sort of think about the way your life fits together as an experience, or the way your life is sort of mutually interconnected to other people and things in the world. And that position of perspective is like opens you up to sort of like a richness of experience that you might not get if you're just thinking about like simple linear causality. But also I think what comes with that is like you have to kind of open yourself up to something else you mentioned, which is like sort of this inevitability of pain and suffering and death and things like that. And you can't sort of look at your life from the top down perspective without having to look at these horrifying parts of it that we often don't want to look at. You can't look at your own life from that perspective and not look at those things. And so in order to like see your life from a certain perspective, you have to be willing to accept these things like death and suffering that we don't want to, that we often don't want to accept. And I think that's what we're seeing at the end. That's what we're seeing at the end, where she is seeing this thing and kind of choosing to engage with this life and open herself up to this life, even though she sort of knows it's going to end in this tragedy and in this separation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very nicely written piece that you read there, and very accurate with regards to Arrival too, I think. I think also, just to kind of maybe rephrase what you said in my own understanding, is that language also kind of functions here as or at least when we sort of abuse language, it becomes this thing that sort of definitively tries to encapsulate something that perhaps should not be encapsulated with that kind of rigidness. Whether it's trying to like apply some kind of rigid linearity to our existence instead of like a more heptapod-like circle-ish shape, or as you said, by kind of trying to look down at the whole of our lives and try to have it make sense in some way that it becomes almost mathematical. I'm also thinking of a line here from Dune, which I think was said by one of the Fremen in the movie, where one of the characters says, like, life is not a mystery to be solved, it's a reality to be experienced.
Right.
And Arrival also kind of touches on that by means of language. I'm not sure exactly how explicit it was in the movie, but there's this quote from the short story that I found really interesting. This is something that Chang had to say about it. I'm just going to read it in full. It's about the way that language also has this kind of. It's not just something that categorizes and labels, but it's also something that has a performative quality. And so, in relation to that Chang he wrote, he mentions the speech act theory. Anyways, he says, according to speech act theory, statements like "you're under arrest," "I christen this vessel," or "I promise" were all performative. A speaker could perform the action only by uttering the words. For such acts, knowing what would be said didn't change anything. Everyone at the wedding anticipated the words, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." But until the minister actually said them, the ceremony didn't count. With performative languages, saying equaled doing. And this is something that I think also very much comes back in Arrival when people ask, like, that question of, if you know the future, is it still worth doing? Or would you change anything? And the question, or as I said, like, the question isn't really like, would you change anything, but kind of, would you do it knowing full well what is going to happen? And
Right.
Louise answers with that affirmative yes, and I think that's precisely because she recognizes, knowing what is to come isn't enough, it has to be performed to some extent in order to become real. And that's, I think, the Arrival is sort of the ultimate embodiment of that, but it comes back in like tiny little ways in a lot of other Villeneuve films that I found really interesting to notice, especially after having seen Arrival and then revisiting some of his other works. There's another moment in Dune, not to get into that movie too much, but where at the beginning, the Atreides, they hold this big ceremony before they get before Arrakis is assigned to them. I'm not sure exactly what exactly happens, but before that, Paul also says to his mother, like, why do I have to do it if everyone already knows what's going to happen? And that's when Jessica or his mother also says, like, well, it's performative, it has to, it's ceremony. There's something in life, or some aspects to life, that you have to do despite knowing what will happen in order to kind of realize them. And I think that's kind of the main point that Arrival makes here also on the use of language, or the role of language in positioning ourselves to life in general.
Yeah.
Not sure if that made sense, but
No, it does.
okay.
I think it's interesting too that you talked about using language almost in like a mathematical sense, and we see kind of the antithesis to Luis's sort of acceptance of the experience of life is the scientist played by Jeremy Renner, I'm forgetting his name, Ian's sort of rejection of that. We kind of like, it's not very explicitly laid out, but we sort of find out that there was a moment where Luis, they have this kid, and then she reveals to Ian what is going to happen, that she knows that she's going to die of cancer in the future, or of this rare disease. And Ian, this is too much for Ian, and he ends up leaving. And the reason that Luis says he left is because he says she made the wrong choice, essentially. So where we see her accepting this experience in spite of the outcome, he's rejecting it, saying, and I think it's interesting that it's the science guy who is doing the rejecting. And I don't think this is like an anti-science statement from this movie, but I think it is this articulation of this idea that science is not this ultimate answer to how we engage with life. It is this it is a language that we are using for our own purposes, but it's not like the ultimate language of life in this specific sense.
Yeah. I think Louise depends as much on the science as Ian does,
Right.
because they make
Yes.
different choices in how to then let it inform their own decision making, which
Yeah.
I think is interesting. So yeah, I definitely agree that this movie is anything but a argument against science. I think in fact it very much promotes like the way of science compared to like the way of the military
Yes.
in this particular context. But yeah, I think in general it very much promotes also the kind of deeper qualities that science stands for, the sort of um, reasoned approach to uncertainties and kind of breaking problems down into little pieces and then just kind of feeling your way through it instead of making these hasty judgments and then acting out of other interests or whatever, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's also worth mentioning, by the way, that the death of the daughter happens very differently in the short story than it does in the movie. Because in the movie, I get why they made the change, but I think it's interesting to kind of talk about anyways. In the movie, she dies of this unstoppable, unpreventable disease, but in the short story, she dies in I think it was like a rock climbing accident. So something that in theory you
Right.
could then prevent.
Yeah.
Which I thought was interesting because it adds that extra element of Louise's embrace of life as it is, even though she
Mm-hmm.
could, in theory, have like uh, the option to significantly alter it. But I understand why the movie didn't go for that, because as I said before, I don't think the movie wanted the discussion to be about, oh, if you know your kid is gonna die
Right. Yeah.
in a rock climbing accident, would you then prevent it or not? And it would kind of lead to these hypothetical scenarios that have less relevance to more general questions that we all have to face, instead of becoming just uh, this more simplistic discussion on, oh, if you could change one thing about your life, would you do it? Or
Right. or just like, I don't know, it manages to present the sort of time paradox, time travel thing without getting too mired in that or feeling like it's getting into cliche territory there, because I feel like that ground has been so tread. You know, I think the key there is it stays very firmly inside her subjective experience, and it's much more about this, like, her experience of it as it's unfolding, than this sense of like, you know, I don't know, questions about time itself, and how it works. It's more about our experience of these things from inside them. While we're in footnotes and addendums, I just want to mention that I love the way the ships take off every time I see this. It's such a beautiful like subversion of sci-fi tropes and kind of what you expect. I think like they've been sitting here and floating here, and you just expect them to like fly into the air or like snap out of existence or something, but they just sort of like drift up and swirl into into a different dimension and kind of disappear. And I think it's a beautiful piece of sci-fi imagery that's very original.
I love the whole design of it. The way also these ships have these kind of rough but very, it's the same surface all over, and it's this very like naturalistic texture, it seems. The only thing that I always can't help but chuckle at a little bit is when they send out that little mini pod just for Louise so she can be taxied up into the real thing. But yeah, I can forgive the little shortcuts that they needed to take before. I was also wondering, just more talking about the movie on that more technical or like story structure level, what did you think about that sort of midpoint section where the movie suddenly goes into montage mode and we get the voiceover from Ian, and it just, the pace suddenly seems to change very much, and
Yeah.
also the perspective and just the type of storytelling just it just has this kind of, there's this sort of twist in tone and matter of presentation that I thought was very interesting. And I was curious, what you did you find it like disjointed, or did you find it just what do you think about it?
I don't mind it too much. I think it's done
Mm-hmm.
pretty well. I'm not sure exactly how else. You need to jump forward in time there at some point, and I'm
Yeah.
not really sure how else you would pull that off necessarily, but unless you were going to make this like a 2.5 hour epic or something like that. But that's one of the things I kind of admire about this movie is like it stays contained. It's not really trying to do much more than what it is. I don't know. I think you could have stayed more naturalistically within the process and maybe shown that unfold a little bit more. But yeah, I don't mind the montage too much.
Yeah, me neither. I like the way it kind of, it allows the movie to do more exposition while also doing it at a higher pace and keeping audiences engaged.
Exposition is not necessarily bad. Just do it good.
Yeah.
Just do good exposition.
Yeah, I guess that's why I wanted to point it out, because it feels like the kind of thing that storytellers would be afraid of doing when you have
Right.
like this whole very grounded, very almost quiet story set up, and then to at the midpoint suddenly go into like this wholly different way of storytelling. I think that's very it is subversive in a way, and therefore might be something that a lot of storytellers shy away from. But I think it can. It's for me, it's like one of those great examples of where knowing where to break the rules, so to say. Because I think it works very good or very well in this movie.
Top marks all around. Great performances too from everybody. I love Forrest Whitaker in this.
Oh yeah.
Everybody's great. Amy Adams is great. So, but yeah, there's a lot of small, like Amy Adams and Jeremy Renner are doing great, but there's a lot of smaller roles, like the Michael Stahlberg, the CIA agent, as well. I think he's great. I love that little scene where they're at that table and he starts talking and Luis is just like, do I have to talk to him? It's fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where would you rank this among Denis Villeneuve's movies?
That's tough. I don't know. I mean, that's tough. I think I would put it. Blade Runner 2049 is the top for me, which I'm not necessarily asserting that's the best movie. That's just my favorite. I think like the first Dune is really good, but I think philosophically on its own, this movie is more interesting than the first Dune. Dune 1 and 2 together might ultimately, I think, be more interesting.
Yeah. It's interesting
so
because Dune is based on like the first part of a story and still had to cut out like a whole bunch.
Right,
and whereas Arrival just was smart enough to take maybe like a short story and then was able to expand on some areas.
Yeah.
Maybe it might be the smarter move to just pick short stories to adapt into movies, especially if they're as well written as the ones from Tai Cheng.
Where do you put it?
I don't know. I pretty high at least. But I also have like, I recognize this movie is very good, and I think it's very thematically rich and cohesive and very clear in what it has to say. But I also have a huge soft spot for Prisoners.
Yeah.
Also for Blade Runner. So I'm guessing top 3, I'd say. I don't really have. I normally don't really care about rankings, but I wasn't super serious when I asked you.
Any recommendations for maybe other sci-fi or films that kind of get into this territory?
Phew.
I'm thinking like the things that come to my mind would be maybe some Tarkovsky. Like if people wanted to branch out from here and get more into that territory of like weird subjective time bending stuff, you could watch like Solaris or Stalker maybe. But yeah, I wasn't sure if you had any other.
Yeah, that's obvious. I mean, I'm guessing if you've seen Arrival, you've also already seen Blade Runner 2049.
Right.
I think maybe one of Denis Villeneuve's first movies. I'm blanking on the name right now, but it's the black and white movie about a school shooter.
Oh, Polytechnique.
Yes, I think that one is also worth revisiting if you look at, especially if you look at it through the lens of the rest of Villeneuve's filmography. I think it's a more even smaller and far more contained story, but it does, if you kind of read between the lines, there's a lot of those themes about embracing life and in spite of suffering and just not letting fear take over and define the whole of your life and existence. And that's something that in some way or another comes back in most of Villeneuve's movies, but I think in that one it did so also in an especially like tragic setting, but that it also like the tragedy of the setting also I think heightened the sort of hope that was found at the end of it. So yeah, I think that would be an interesting watch if you have also seen Arrival.
Great. Thanks so much for watching or listening to this episode. If you're listening to this and you don't know yet, there is a video version available now. You can find it on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/@cinemaofmeaning, or you can watch it on Nebula, nebula.tv/watch cinema of meaning. The audio versions are still in the same place. Again, check out that Nebula subscription. With Nebula, you don't just get access to this podcast, you also get access to our videos, bonus content from both of us at class Tom made. There's a bunch of stuff on there, so check that out. Nebula.tv/cinema of meaning to sign up. You'll get a discount with that code. We appreciate watching and your support. If you want to get more involved in the community, you can also join our Discord. Tell us what you thought of Arrival or Denis Villeneuve's work as a whole. Which is your favorite? Where would you place this one? You can find information about how to join the Discord in the description. We'll talk to you next week. Thanks so much for listening.